couple of things before we get into the Q&A, and there is a question about admin consent around application registrations, and we'll jump into that. For me, conditional access will always be in my top 5. Understand what it is, understand how it works inside of your organization, understand what Microsoft prescribes. Things like app control policies is amazing, and you can do all of those profiling things that Nick talked about. If you're coming from a country that, that has state actors with nefarious characters, you can do cool things around not hindering the productivity inside of your organization, but reducing functionality so that people can still read content, but they can't necessarily download content because they can't. It's deemed a risky login. Restrict application registrations, Nick.
Wouldn't it be nice if we lived in a world where we didn't automatically grant consent to applications being installed by users without restrictions, or even by administrators? And this is what we would want to do from day one is, look, I have this setting that's on in my tenant. Should this be on? And that setting is to restrict application registrations without an extra step. So to raise that friction for both users and administrators alike, so that those applications aren't just found in your tenant.
Yeah, it's found being the operative statement, right? And it's the same thing when looking at service principals and managed identities, right? One step from a consent perspective is to restrict application registrations. When we speak to customers who have got Teams fatigue, where literally I've got a customer currently, I think they've got more Teams than users. Yeah. More Teams than users. Because, it was look under your chair, right? A good friend of mine about a year and a half ago, he got involved in as a contractor into an organization to help them with, what Teams looks like. And he said you would never guess how many Teams this organization has. They had over 100,000 Teams. I mean, just from a data security perspective, we got a customer currently that's got one team with over 500 gigs of data in the team. And like what? Do you take a file server and just move it to that single team?
Wow.
So understand what this looks like. From a managed identity perspective, understand what it does, how it talks to Key Vault and, deployment tokens and access and, all the token stuff like Linus Tech Tips when you got hacked, right? Understand the importance of managed identities and how to govern managed identities. Just because you think that managed identities is more secure, it doesn't mean that it's actually secure. And then again, coming back to not only restricting application registrations, but understanding the concept of app consent, Nick. And you were talking about it now.
Absolutely. So what we want to do is at every measure, we want to switch off the automatic enabling of applications with users who can, by default, do way too many things, Al. And just in the interest of time, this boils down to let's turn off the tap of this unmanaged stuff. Zunder. Yeah. Let's invoke the Zunder and say, with app consent and restricting app registrations, we are turning off the tap. We are ensuring that we can stop the flow of applications that automatically appear or automatically appear on our tenant.
And then the last thing, right? And from an API perspective, Graph is an API. They have a ton of endpoints, and we spend a lot of time. A simple thing, Nick, you can, depending on the Graph consent that you've given to that application registration, because it wants to read, I can read Azure, not Azure, Active Directory extension attributes, the on-premises extension attribute. I can actually read it. You don't necessarily see it show up inside of Entra ID from a user object perspective.
That's right.
You need to know where to look. But if I've got the right API permissions, I can do that lookup. I even know what the extension attribute is because I want to check a value. And depending on how you configure that, you can do these things, right? And we've seen horror stories, right? I mean, Nick's always got that example of, and I can say her name because she's not in the room, when you actually deployed Alexa consent, giving Alexa consent to read your calendar.
That's right.
And if you look at the API permissions, you'll be surprised that it's not just read, it's read all. So they can read all the calendars, not
That's right.
just your calendar, right? And I mean, we've talked about that before. So, looking at those 10 things that you can actually physically do, have a look at the top 5 we believe you should actually investigate and spend more time in. And also go out there and to get that inventory, because all these standards, all these frameworks start with the number one thing right at the top. It says inventory.
That's right.
Have a look into what you have currently, because you're not spinning up a new tenant today. Any final closing comments, thoughts before we go over to the Q&A?
Gosh,
we don't have an hour.
We don't have an hour. Let me say this one thing, and you basically just said it out. Every single one of our customers that we've ever done one of these from or for said, I didn't know I had ... And everything, as you say, starts with inventory. So we cannot manage what we don't measure. And so we need to start with that. So top takeaway from me is start measuring with inventory.